Good morning to all of you, and to Your Excellency, Dr. Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Finance Minister of Indonesia, Emeritus Senior Minister Mr. Goh Chok Tong, patron of the Singapore Summit, distinguished guests and friends. On behalf, as was said earlier by Jennifer, on behalf of Singapore's 4 premier economic agencies, EDB, MAS, GIC, and Temasek, I'd like to welcome all our very many returning as well as our first-time participants to this 6th edition of the Singapore Summit. Now, as is the norm in Singapore, I have been volunteered into this new position, and as a new chairman of this gathering for a little while longer, I'd like to thank Mr. George Yeo, who many of you will remember from your past participation at these summits, for his very invaluable leadership as chairman during the past 5 years. He's told me that he's enjoyed every single summit, and in particular the networking opportunities. And although he's not able to join us here today, he sends his best wishes to all the friends he's made over the years. Now, my job this morning is to warm you all up for our main speaker, Dr. Sri Mulyani. And also, I'm told I'm supposed to set the tone for the rest of the sessions today. Now, when I was asked to do that, I immediately thought of this ancient blessing or curse, which, as you know, it goes, "May you live in interesting times." I think it's more a curse than a blessing these days. And to admit that these are interesting times is really probably the understatement of the year. And just as climate change has unleashed monster hurricanes recently, the thunderstorms of populism and unbalanced globalization have wreaked political maelstroms across the world. First Brexit, and now America first. And before, potential missile bases based on reclaimed islands in the South China Sea, and now intercontinental missiles possibly raining down on Guam. And last night, yet another terrorist attack in London. And so the rare so-called black swan has become as commonplace as ducks in a pond, and thinking the unthinkable has actually become cocktail chatter. For all of us who are business leaders whose priorities are stability and risk mitigation, these are pretty stressful times indeed. This year's summit will focus on 3 interrelated themes. The first session is entitled Navigating the New World Order, Critical Uncertainties and Possible Scenarios. Now, the end of the Cold War was supposed to usher in, according to political scientist Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. Western liberal democracy would become the sole political system in the world with its superiority unchallenged. Now, of course, the opposite has come about. The New World Order has ironically become the New World Disorder. And the legitimacy of Western liberal democracy and its handmaiden, economic globalization, has been seriously undermined by numerous reactionary populist movements which have come to power, including even in the United States. The America First doctrine of the Trump administration, with its somewhat isolationist overtones, has created a vacuum in global affairs which other countries may in due course fill. But on the other hand, China's increasing assertiveness in the South China Sea is blunted by its open inability to rein in North Korea's belligerence. So what are the flashpoints in Asian geopolitics? How and when may they erupt? And how do we basically take shelter? The ramifications of all these changes and what scenarios might result will occupy the discourse of our first session's panelists. Staying interconnected and interdependent is a theme of the second plenary session. Now, in the face of uncertainties about American foreign and trade policies, China has emerged as an unexpected champion of globalization, free trade, and global connectivity. But with the 19th National Congress soon to be convened, there are also questions about whether China's domestic issues will inhibit its rise to global preeminence. And to what extent are recent events, whether in Europe, the USA, or Asia, immutable and permanent? There's already talk that a soft Brexit might morph over the long years of stalled negotiations back to some form of face-saving non-exit. And similarly, the American pendulum may well swing back after next year's congressional elections and be reflected in the next presidential elections. So these vexing issues will occupy the second session. Facing up to inequalities, harnessing technological advancements and redefining policies to address societal challenges which is a somewhat long title. It will be the title for what will actually be a quite intriguing topic. And basically, this third session will address the notion that technological improvements, such as in the hot areas of robotics and artificial intelligence, which are touted to be the next big thing after the internet, provide both the means to redress widening societal inequities as well as to exacerbate the divide. We all know, but too often forget, that technology is always simply an enabler without any inherent social or ethical proclivities. And it is people, their idealism, their selfishness, their values, which give technology its moral or immoral impetus. And so whether robotics will enrich the lives of the elderly in demographically shrinking societies or displace millions of third world textile workers due to a process economists call premature deindustrialization will be entirely due to policymakers and business leaders. And most likely, of course, it will be a mix of both as we muddle towards progress with 2 steps forwards and 1 step backwards. Yet another theme we'll be tackling today is intergenerational dialogue and succession. And therefore, this year, we're happy to launch for the first time the Young Societal Leaders Program with 18 young societal leaders from the region, ranging from Egypt to Afghanistan to India and the Philippines. And they will join us in this afternoon's plenary session, where we hope the leaders of tomorrow and the leaders of today will be able to, in fact, exchange views. Under this new program, we'll be bringing every year a whole cohort of young people from the region, not just to take part in this conference, but to actually spend 4 or 5 days in Singapore to get to know each other better as young societal leaders from the region, and also to get to know Singapore better. We're also going to be very privileged today to have the Finance Minister of Indonesia and the Prime Minister of Bhutan to address us. All these themes are going to be discussed against the backdrop and within the context of a few long-term trends. The first is what I call Back to the Future. Some of you may remember the science fiction movie series in the 1980s about time travel into the past in order to see the future. And I think this is a particularly relevant trend because some people now talk very worriedly about the end of Pax Americana and the decline of Western civilization's global dominance. And on the other hand, Asian triumphalists talk about burying the West in some form of almost Stalinist propaganda. Mostly, however, we tend to forget that before the ascendancy of the West, starting some 300 years ago, the world consisted actually of regional civilizations, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, all thriving and jostling under the sun. And this past may well hold the key to understanding the future, which is that our world may yet again consist of largely co-equal competing civilizations without a single dominant superpower or civilization. And it may have all the attendant frictions, but in the main, they may coexist with each other. And in fact, the dominance of a single civilization, the broadly Judeo-Christian culture which we call the West, for the past few centuries, that dominance may have been more an aberration than the norm, and we may be returning back to the norm. The second trend is what I call the end of universalism and the rise of contextualism. And again, like following the first trend, Western civilizational dominance was due to the confluence of several factors which historians have variously identified as the rule of law, the scientific or empirical approach to intellectual inquiry, the separation of state and church, and a liberal democratic state. And because of this, Western liberal democracy has been seen as the universal norm towards which every political system should aspire. But going back to the future, however, more and more societies probably will recognize, particularly within Asia, that their own historical context should influence, if not determine, political institutions. A 5,000-year-old civilization where political legitimacy, or the so-called mandate of heaven, has depended more on delivering the fruits of good governance rather than the specific structures of parliamentary democracy, that may in fact hold the key to China's political evolution and to our understanding of it. A contextualist approach to looking at the world recognizes, for example, that there has never been a single universal form of capitalism. And during the halcyon days of Wall Street exuberance before its near collapse with the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, everyone thought that Wall Street or American capitalism was and should be the universal norm. Now, of course, many people recognize that there are other variants of capitalism shaped by their own historical context. And whether it be the Japanese, Korean, Scandinavian, or even the Singapore model of capitalism, each has its own paradoxes and permutations and our routes to pragmatic success. I think the point here is that if Asian business leaders are to build their own model of capitalism within their own historical context, perhaps they should look back at their own communitarian ethos which underpins our own societies and not have to accept that the highly individualized ethos, the intentionally wide compensation disparities, and the extreme short-termism which has characterized American capitalism, that need not necessarily be our norm. We can and should create our own variant of communitarian capitalism. And that leads me to the third and the final point that we see as a possible long-term trend. And that I call that, in a single word, from shareholder to stakeholder. The very essence of communitarian capitalism is embedded in the replacement of the word shareholder by stakeholder, where the shareholder is undoubtedly one of the very primary stakeholders, but where the interests of the community, the customer, employees, suppliers, all these are also critical. And if we believe that business is a fundamental force for good and a critical change agent, then it follows that the most pressing issues of the future, education, inequality, climate change, to name just a few, all that requires a multi-stakeholder approach. And if all of us as CEOs practiced more stakeholder-driven capitalism, and if we rewarded our executives, including ourselves, by appropriate KPIs or balanced scorecards, which can weight the appropriate impact of each category of stakeholder, we can perhaps do away altogether with a relatively futile, false dichotomy of corporate social responsibility versus total shareholders' return, or CSR versus TSR. We can, in fact, reframe the debate altogether in new terms as creators of a new world and not beholden to the past. And this theme will be discussed also tomorrow in the roundtable with DPM about short-termism in corporate circles. So on that note, I look forward to all of us learning from each other today and having a very fruitful dialogue and a fruitful 6th edition of the Singapore Summit. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure now to move to our first event of the day, the S. Rajaratnam Endowment Dialogue, named in honor of Singapore's first foreign minister. We are honored to welcome as a speaker Her Excellency Dr. Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia since last year. Many of you in this room would know her in her various incarnations in the World Bank and also as Minister of Finance in the past. She has served in the same position as Minister of Finance from 2005 to 2010, and she's also held the positions of Coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs and National Development Planning. In 2010, during a hiatus in the period of being in government, she joined the World Bank and its Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer and chaired the International Development Association, the World Bank's fund for the poorest countries. She has also been an Executive Director of the IMF. And I was asking her just now whether she prefers living in Jakarta or in Washington. And I think you said at least in Washington there was more privacy than you have now, but you're not quite sure where the traffic jams are worse. Minister Sri Mulyani is highly regarded internationally, as all of you who are in the banking circles would know. She's also an extremely good friend of Singapore, has been here many times, and is regarded not only by our national leadership, but by the business community here as an incredibly level-headed, pragmatic person who at the same time has very big visions for Indonesia. So can I ask you to join me to welcome Minister Dr. Sri Mulyani Indrawati. Your Excellency, please.